The panelists are all here, and let me introduce the chair of the panel, Professor Bogárdi, who is for the co-organizers, also research professor, water engineer, how he calls himself, at the Public Service University, but foremost for 9 years part of our community in iASK, although he is a water engineer by profession, but he is more interdisciplinary as many of us. So I give the floor to him. He has a big geographical scope around all continents and a lot of experience in international organizations.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We are always a little bit behind schedule, but this does not mean we are behind the themes. And after this very challenging panel which started this winter school, we are now entering the second panel where Ambassadors for Peace Initiative, Pathways, Challenges to Cooperation. So it's a different viewpoint to the same problem which was so vividly shown on the examples of Western Balkans and Caucasian countries in the first panel. I will refrain from telling all the CV details of my panelists because this is this beautiful book which gives it much more succinctly what I could do. We shall have a sequence starting with Philippe Lombaerde, who is the director of the UNU Institute in Brix on regional cooperation studies. Then we have an online contribution from Emil Brix from Vienna. Then we shall give the floor to Donato and Emma, who are in two subsequent presentations will present the very interesting title, The Peace Offensive, which means offensive is normally associated with military actions, but it also can underline that peace is...
Strategy.
Yes, sir, yes. I just wanted to say peace is so important that we have to fight for it literally. And the session will end with Réka Varga's presentation. She's a dean of the state and international state administration and international studies in the Ludovika University of Public Service in Budapest. Sometimes I say that we start with the ladies first, but now I'm using a different Hungarian word. The whip is hitting at the end, so therefore ladies will finish this panel. All the best, and Philippe, the floor is yours. 15 minutes each. Please keep the time that we may save some time for discussion.
Thank you very much. I have a PowerPoint, if you could put that up. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, thanks again to Ferenc and the organizers for inviting me and being the keynote here in this panel. Now I was asked to do a short keynote, so that's always a bit complicated, but honoring Rector Marwala's grandmother, I will be glad to do it try to do it in 15 minutes. I will try to provide a sort of framework for this panel, and this panel is about thinking creatively about cooperation, new forms of cooperation, new forms of diplomacy also, in order to contribute to stability, peace within communities, in wider communities, regionally, globally. So I will provide a few, let's say, concepts, a few ideas to start, and then my colleagues in the panel, the real ambassadors, that's the title also of this panel, the real ambassadors are here around the table, will then further develop these ideas and come up with a few new ideas related to new forms of cooperation. The starting point, of course, is this, and it has already been mentioned yesterday. This is a graph showing the evolution of conflicts since the Second World War. It's a sad, frustrating graph where you see almost a linear increase in conflicts worldwide. Of course, it has been said, it depends on how you measure them exactly and so on, and what do you include and what not. But in any case, the trend is clear, with a a development which is worth mentioning since, let's say, more or less 2010, an increase in what they call internationalized civil conflicts that start within the confines of a country, but then spread and involve external actors, become regional, sometimes with a global dimension too. So that is, let's say, the starting point and the background against which we have our discussion today. I would like to focus on, let's say, the triangle that you have between peace and conflict on the one hand, interactions, interdependence on the other hand, and then institutions and cooperation, a sort of triangle. I think the discussion will refer to this triangle and then we'll elaborate on that triangle. It's a complicated triangle. There are optimistic ideas about how, for example, a conflict or the probability of conflict relates to the level of interaction, the level of interdependence. Optimism in the sense that the more interdependent we become, the lesser probability you will see in terms of conflict, because we do not really have an interest in starting a conflict with other communities which we have close relationships. I can refer to the Kantian peace triangle and based on writings of the 18th century already. More recently, we have become more, let's say, conscious of the ambiguity of these relationships between interdependence, conflict, and the role of institutions. Less optimistic due to recent events here in Europe and elsewhere. I think the way to think about this is, and of course it's obvious in a way, is that we are before a complex system operating where you cannot reduce the functioning of that complex system to, let's say, simple causalities and linear causalities, one variable leading to another, one policy intervention leading to a particular policy outcome. These simplicities do not work, but that does not mean, of course, that causal relationships do not exist within that complex system. And there are possibilities, of course, still to use levers, to use policy variables, to provoke certain outcomes, which can then lead sometimes to virtual circles, to mechanisms that go in the right direction. Let me say a few words about cooperation, just to give sort of a framework for our discussion. Cooperation comes in, institutions come in within that triangle. Very often we pose our hopes in these institutions, and we hope that these institutions will make the difference in this complex system. And of course, there are instances where you can clearly point to the role of institutions and the positive role that institutions are playing or have been playing. And sometimes we also underestimate when the institutions work well, nobody notices, but they're working. When they do not work well, when they collapse, then they are noticed. There are institutions that play a role in the background. Sometimes treaties are signed, institutions are built, and they keep functioning. They keep functioning in the background, providing, for example, opportunities to trade between countries, bilaterally, regionally, and so on. But these things are not noticed. So I think it's important, and that is, I think, then the role of academia and all of us, to show this also and to bring that to the table. What can we say about the role of institutions in general, and then the role of institutions in the context of peace, security, more specifically. We've tried to do this in the book you see there. No, you don't see it. Now you can see it. Yeah, I didn't show you this slide, sorry. These are the Kantian triangle and then Roderick's impossibility theorem, referring to the impossibility of combining the Kantian triangle with national sovereignty and the problem of national sovereignty within that context. But then coming to the point on cooperation, I think what is important is, as I said, for us, is to show when institutions, regional cooperation works, when it does not work, what are the conditions for cooperation to be working. In this handbook, which is open access, so you're all invited to have a look at it, we have tried to do this for a number of policy areas, to ask systematically, first, why should there be cooperation in the first place? Why should there be? What are the normative theories? What are the arguments in favor of cooperation? Second, where has that been implemented and in which form? And then third, what is the empirical evidence? I mean, what can we say about this? And I think that is something that is important to bring to the table, because very often when we talk about institutions and the EU and so on, the NATO, it's opinions, and there's opinions in favor, against, but there is also certain empirical evidence which can be useful within these discussions. Now we have to be honest, in a number of cases the results are mixed. You cannot simply say creating an institution leads to this or that. There are mixed. For example, the growth promise. Trade, monetary integration will lead to more growth. Empirically, it's very difficult to prove this. Security cooperation. There, of course, you have to use more qualitative ways to address this. It's also quite difficult to come up with, let's say, a clear result of security cooperation in terms of more security. Regional migration governance is another example. But there are a number of other results that are robust and which should be shown. There is a relationship between trade liberalization and trade, exchange rate stabilization, trade, common markets lead to growth, tax cooperation, democracy clauses work to some extent. The role of regional courts in the protection of human rights. There are very good examples that it works and it can work, and so on. So I think this is important to emphasize. Now the graph that you see there in the middle shows us the number of regional organizations, and that's the traditional form of regional cooperation, the more formalized form. You see that graph. Now if you combine this graph with my first graph, this one, then of course you arrive at some kind of, say, pessimistic conclusion. The more regional cooperation we have in the form of organizations, that's an important addition. I mean, the growth of these organizations does not apparently necessarily lead to less conflicts. So there's a bit of a sort of contradiction. Huh? So we had this optimistic view there. Well, if you have more interaction, more interdependence combined with institutions and institutionalized forms of cooperation, the probability of conflict will reduce. And so the expectation is a sort of bell-shaped curve. And when you start from no interaction, if there is no interaction, there cannot be a conflict, of course. That's sort of, and you move in the direction of more interaction and interdependence, high levels of interdependence, you would have a sort of bell-shaped curve of the probability of having conflicts. That is a bit the expectation. The thing is, when you move further to the right on that graph, that you don't really see this happening. That is. Then the before last slide, regional security cooperation. That is a specific form of cooperation. Now, all forms of cooperation can lead to stability, peace, and within that, let's say, expectation of relationship between interdependence and peace. Now, regional security cooperation is a specific form of cooperation. Since, let's say, the 1950s, we have seen these organizations emerging, and typically we saw on the one hand, security organizations and then the economic organizations on the other hand. Over time, this has changed. The panorama has changed. We have now more general purpose organizations, less task-specific organizations. Nowadays, we have many regional organizations that have broadened their mandate and their agendas. But regional cooperation is an element in a number of these organizations. There is also, as you know, a provision in the UN Charter to give a specific role to these regional organizations in the area of peace and security. There is some theorizing around this. Sometimes we look for the factors that explain regional security cooperation outside of the region, like external factors, the broader global factors that play, the big powers, these dynamics. Sometimes we find the factor rather inside the region, and these factors explain. So that depends. What regional cooperation does is also varied. I listed there a few of these functions: promoting regional security dialogue, developing a human security agenda, consolidating democracy and human rights, deploying peace operations, focusing on a military state-centric agenda. The military is not so prominent. When you look at really at security cooperation, the military element is not so prominent. While we very often associate, of course, security with the military, but if you look at what they actually do, these organizations, then that is not necessarily the case. In security cooperation, just like in any other field of regional cooperation and cooperation in general, organizations can be effective or less effective. That is also what we see. Now, there, I would say, we very often look at the output side of these organizations. What do they do? What do they manage to do? It's also important to look at the input side. What are the resources that they really have to do what they are supposed to do? What is the mandate that they have to do what they are supposed to do? You hear the critiques vis-à-vis the UN in general, but you hear it also vis-à-vis other regional organizations. And organizations, of course, which are essentially intergovernmental bodies mostly, or practically exclusively, can do what they are allowed to do by their member states, of course. I think the graph is relevant also for the rest of then the panel. When we say regional cooperation, we are not only talking about the formal forms of the institutionalized forms, but there are also informal ways of regionally cooperating. We talk about security dialogues, for example. We talk about new forms of diplomacy, para-diplomacy, and I think some of the colleagues here around the table will further develop this. So I will conclude by saying that cooperation institutions are an important aspect within our triangle between interactions, interdependent on the one hand, peace and conflict on the other hand. There are very good cases, theoretical cases, normative theories, normative cases for more regional cooperation. There are also good arguments in favor of an important role for regional cooperation within the multilateral system. When we talk about UN reform and all this, I think regions need to play a role there. At the same time, regions are diverse, they're overlapping, they are not omnipresent. Not in all parts of the world you have these regional arrangements in place. Regions are sometimes delivering, they are not always effective. We have to be clear about that also. And then to finish, we have a number of topics to be studied, topics for thesis, for those in search of thesis topics. There's the whole story, of course, about UN reform, UN Security Council reform. That's not new, but it's still there, and it will stay there until we arrive at a moment, hopefully not after a disaster, looking at Professor Cleary. Multipolarity, multiplex world, how that relates to cooperation, the relationship between the formal forms of cooperation and the informal forms, the role of different kind of actors playing at different levels. I think that is a very important aspect also. So I think I will stop here, and sorry for abusing a bit of your...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for setting the stage for this panel. And now we are linking up with Emil Brix from Vienna. And till the technical part of this linkage is created, I just want to ask you to think of the map of Europe in 1914, when the Europe started to make itself decomposing from the position it occupied in the world in the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And if you look at the map of Europe today, you see that all the major players of the First World War, Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, are still on the map of Europe. The only one country which was a major player and disappeared was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you just had, and you look into European history in the last 110 years, you see that the Central European place ever since was fragmented even more. The first panel of this school gave you the insight how the countries of the Balkan are grappling with this problem. And now we are having a very distinguished diplomat, former head of the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, to address us. And certainly the history of Vienna as one of the major capital cities of Europe is inevitably will be resonating in his talk. Thank you very much, and Emil, the floor is yours.
Good morning from Austria, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. I didn't expect that I should speak also about the tradition of the Habsburg monarchy, but actually the chair is absolutely right, because the idea of how you can keep together cooperation in spite of different identities of an institution or a corporation is of uttermost importance. And I would like to speak a little bit about how I see that this can be done, less analyzing how the situation at the moment is. We have done this already yesterday, and I guess this morning. All the transformation tell us that the disruption that we are experiencing now is, at least in our lifetime, has never been as deep as this. And we have to take into account that without the experience of former centuries, we will not understand what's going on at the moment. Let me start not with the Congress of Vienna, but with the Board of Peace. You've already mentioned yesterday the Board of Peace and possibly also his initial meeting in Washington last week. Why do I do this? Because the formulation of the Board of Peace by Mr. Trump and his administration is nothing less. Can you still see me and hear me? Hello? Hello, can you still hear me? Yes. Hello?
Excellent.
Yes? Yes, good. Because the formulation of this is an expression of the failure of a global institution like the United Nations to solve major conflicts around the globe at this moment. But the way it was formed, this Board of Peace, is not built on that something that we expect that we need in cooperation. That means equal rights. That means also including issues like human security, issues like other UN bodies like UNESCO or WHO are dealing with. But it's simply built on the idea that if you have powerful actors, then you can achieve peace. And I think there we have a real problem. So for me, the US administration and the formulation of the Board of Peace is a real challenge to the United Nations system. I don't say that I like the instruments, or I don't say that I like the formula of the Board of Peace, but this is something in our age of a competition between global powers has become a form of cooperation that we have to live with as it looks like at this very moment. My second point is really about how can we deal with this situation of different forms of cooperation, which are so much concentrating on power relations as they are at this moment. I think, and there maybe the Habsburg tradition of a multinational empire can be helpful, and possibly even the European Union example. The European Union, when it was formed, it was all about peace in Europe. And it was not so much directed towards creating a zone of peace between different ideological areas in the West and the East. It only turned out that during the Cold War period, and actually even nowadays, it's also about external factors that Europe should be involved and has an experience of being involved. So the challenge for a regional organization like the institution and organization like the European Union is how can it have an impact on what we are talking about, human security and peace building, positive peace building. I would say we have two elements to take into account which make it difficult, but help us maybe to understand how regional organizations can act, should act when we look at Europe. The European Union is trying to create an internal market. It's not perfect, it's not there, the capital market is not there, there is no real internal market. But actually there are two areas where there is no interest of the member states of the European Union to create an internal market. And these two areas, one of them is culture and cultural policy, and the other one is educational policies. These are two areas which in the treaties of the European Union are supposed to belong to the member states. What does this tell us? This tells us actually that those elements where we believe that cooperation is of utmost importance, education and cultural cooperation, are left out of a building like the European Union. And that is true also for our parts of cooperation. It is not outside the remit of the UN system, but when you look at the UN system again, UNESCO, for instance, is an example. When you have a powerful player like the United States who think that this is not of any interest to them, that there is a cultural and educational cooperation, they just suspend their membership or leave the organization. So if you want to build up something like human security in the given moment, and if you want to build up something like a stable and possibly even just system, you need to concentrate on education and culture. That is without saying that I would not accept that we live in an age of hard power and military might and power relations. But if you really believe that there is a chance for something like improving the situation of human security, then you have to invest in culture and the arts. And even the European Union realized this. So there is nowadays some sort of subsidiary possibility to support also cultural cooperation within the European Union with common European Union money. But this is not it is not actually a priority of cooperation in the European Union, and there exist only a few cultural projects which are more than symbolic. For instance, we have European cities of culture every year in the European Union, but more or less these are symbolic actions. They may be interesting for the local urban situation to invest into cultural projects, but that's more or less it. So there is not really an attempt to create something like cultural cooperation which goes beyond what we always did when we talk about culture, that there is some sort of I don't know, diplomacy of sending exhibitions abroad, or sending orchestras abroad, or these sort of things. But it's not about identity building. And in the European Union, the idea that you can do a cooperation, a cultural cooperation, which helps us to get some sort of common identity, of common values and common goods, is hard to achieve. And if this is the case, even in the European Union, where you have a very, very interested integration project which wants to have integration in all areas, then it is one of our major problems. And the same is true for education. The competence for educational issues in the European Union is with the individual 27 member countries. Why is this so? Because politicians in the European Union are elected in their own countries, and they do know that if they give up the competence of education and about cultural policies, then it may be detrimental to their domestic interests that they have. And here we have to start in thinking about what can we do to create these sort of cooperative forms in education and in culture which help us to overcome this. And I accept that the UNESCO was exactly founded with this idea after the Second World War within the UN system. But there was one major, I would say, birth defect of UNESCO. It's an organization which deals with states. It deals with sovereign nations and with states. And more and more in the last decades, the world has developed into something which is more decided by other actors, by civil society, by multinationals, by all sorts of initiatives, by NGOs, than by state actors alone. And I agree that UNESCO and other international organizations try to integrate all these elements, but we are still not there. So I would say, if we really believe that we have a way to use culture and education as a positive element in our attempt to create peace, which depends on dialogue, trust, and cooperation, then we have to better integrate all these elements into the structure that we have. And the major thing in all of this is that we have to do with a time when narratives are more and more influential concerning also the situation of security and culture. And these narratives are more or less always national narratives still. And just think about the fact that just last week we learned that Russia decided to turn its Gulag Museum in Moscow into a museum of the Nazi regime against the Russian population. So there is this sort of public narrative, which not only in the Russian Federation, but in quite a few parts of our world, is going more and more towards helping the national interest as it is defined by the political leaders. And this sort of battle of narratives is something which is not helpful in achieving the forms of cooperation that we need. And actually, this is one of the basic problems in the war in Ukraine, because there's not only a war on the battlefield, but also a war of narratives, as we know. And the same holds true for the conflict in Gaza and in the Middle East. It's also a battle of narratives, as we experience even in our educational systems around the globe. When you have in most universities a battle of narratives between Palestinian interests, Israel interests, Jewish interests, and all these discussions, then you see what I'm talking about. And to overcome this battle of narratives, the chance we have is that arts, culture, education can be actually oriented towards this. I have been director of the Vienna School of Diplomacy, Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, for 8 years. And the only thing I really wanted to teach, and the only thing that we do as this institution, is try to find out how can we give young people a chance to create arenas of cooperation and of dialogue. How can we create them to understand how dialogue can be enhanced? What are the dimensions that we have there? And the basic idea is always, we've always been saying, don't underestimate that you are living in a time of power games, power and the power expression around, but try to think beyond this. Try to create fields of common goods that you can personally increase, and how can you de-escalate conflicts by doing this? Even the beginning of the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna in the 18th century was only done for one thing. It was for understanding our then major neighbor in the Habsburg monarchy, that was the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, because when the Academy was founded in 1854, it was a few decades only after the big wars between Christian Europe and the Ottomans. Our then empress, by the way, a woman as empress in the Habsburg monarchy, she said, I do want to have diplomats who understand the culture of our main opponent, of the Ottoman Empire. And what did she do? She created this academy with mainly teaching them the language of the opponent, the language of the neighbor. So everybody had to learn in Vienna Turkish. And a lot of them had to learn later on Arabic. English came only in the middle 19th century as one of the languages. So dialogue starts with understanding our identities. Then it comes to speaking the language. Speaking the language means really go into the culture of your partner. And thirdly, then work with them, do dialogue with them. So this was not only the foundation of this academy, but it's the foundation of how we have a chance to overcome this state-oriented, national-oriented, of national interest-oriented, global insecure order that we are in. So once the global order stabilizes, and it will stabilize when power relations are organized in a way which all of them more or less dissatisfies or satisfies, then culture and the arts will be of utmost importance to create in this stable system enough cooperation to make it viable and not to be based only on institutions, but on those people who go through the areas of education, those who work in the fields of arts and culture, and those, because those are the people that also who create narratives, or at least who have to live with the narratives that we have. So overcoming the narratives which are at the moment very confrontational is, I think, the best contribution that we can make to human security at the moment, be it in Europe or be it globally. It is a very difficult task, but we could also talk about positive examples that are there. So my final word is, we have to live with the Board of Peace, who is challenging the UN system, because it's a time of the monsters where the big powers are influential. What we can do is really to make sure that those people we educate understand the role of arts, culture, education in creating as much space for the common goods as possible. And then let's see what the new stable system gives us in chances for cooperation. And all this means that it will not be something like Habsburg Empire, which was not ideal because it was also very hierarchical, and it did not really try to give equal shares of power to every part of it. And the Hungarians were always very unsatisfied with what Vienna was doing. But at least there was some sort of cultural possibility of exchange, which went beyond what we are doing at the moment. And when you look at who invented the 20th century intellectually, a lot of people would say it came from the multinational Habsburg Empire with Sigmund Freud or Gustav Mahler, and you name all these people. And there is a lot in it. So if we really come to a situation where arts, culture, and education are giving a place in the future of our corporations, then we create also a situation where human security and positive peace is much more possible than in a situation where we only believe on institutions as we are used to have them at the moment. Finally, even someone who was a realist like Henry Kissinger, in his big book on diplomacy, he speaks a lot about national interests, but there is also a chapter how important common goods are for the survival of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am tempted to thank you in German for your very thoughtful presentation to show that the language plays an important role, but I still keep it in English. Thank you for your very appealing words on the narratives, which I believe should resonate in this room for the rest of this winter school. It's my privilege now to invite a subgroup within our panel, because now Donato and Emma will share their 15 minutes together to present what is a very interesting and appealing offensive, a peace offensive, or an offensive for peace. And the floor is yours to explain us why the world should look to Maribor. What are your thoughts how academics, artists together could do something good for the peace, for us in the whole world? Floor is yours.
János, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who's here. Yesterday we already started with presenting a bit the Global Peace Offensive, an initiative that started as an internal reflection of the World Academy of Art and Science. I see that here we have a presentation that I prepared, but that so far, I mean, let's keep it there. I mean, I don't want to distract you. So we have also a presentation on what we did yesterday on the human security agenda and the importance of human security for peace. We have done so much work also with the Interparliamentary Union that is represented here. But now let's see what is the progress of the Global Peace Offensive initiative that, as I was saying, started in 2024 as a World Academy of Art and Science internal reflection. And I associated to that many international organizations, to begin with the Club of Rome and the Interparliamentary Union, several specialized institutions on peace and security, and as a sort of testing ground to see how. I don't like the word resonate. Why I don't like the word resonate? I like the word appealing. I still like the word, and I prefer the word story to the word narrative. Because narrative is Dostoevsky. Yesterday someone mentioned Dostoevsky. That is narrative. we live in a world of stories. Let's go back to the storytelling, to the importance of associating stories. But I mean, it's typical of me because I'm polemic, naturally. So when I see the majority going for some wording, I take the other course immediately. So it's natural for me. But now let's go back to the substance. The substance of this initiative is so important now. We were talking of polarization. We're talking of heightened tensions, of disregard towards human dignity and moral principles in international relations. So this is why we necessitate new strategies. We necessitate new strategies for conflict prevention and resolutions. Strategies which the academic community, but not exclusively, the business community, cultural community in general, diplomacy as well can adopt. And here, that's why we aim at combining forces, is the collaborative effort that can change the situation. It's not one actor that can change the whole thing. So that's why we want to make sure that cultural diplomacy plays an important role, but also we need to make sure that education plays an important role. We need to give young people a possibility to be advocates for themselves. I mean, how they want to shape their future. And this is so important because activism needs to be sometimes structured in the sense that it needs to have a purpose. And so in order to obtain results. So going back to the theory was a way to revisit an approach that was used in the 60s, promoted by Charles Osgood, an influential behavioralist, thinker that worked on disarmament affairs. I met him in UCLA when I was still a student. Then, I started reading many years later his books that nobody knew, by the way. If you, 2 years ago, you were on the web and write Charles Osgood, you wouldn't find a single article. Now you find the whole literature. I don't know why. So maybe it's a measure of our success. The fact that we started talking about it and we had so many events. So we had so many events and principally, as you were saying, in Maribor, not far from here, in Slovenia, we found the perfect locus. We found the perfect place for these internal discussions and reflections. So we had a statement about the Global Peace Offensive. We had also a vision document that was presented by the European Academy in Science and Art, that is our partner in that, together with the World Academy. And we, as I said, revisiting this approach, we presented it in such a way that is succinct and is a call for action. So what we said, we have to work towards strategic de-escalation. We have to try to lower the bar of the tension as much as possible with localized initiatives using cultural, scientific, economic, educational, and environmental diplomacy. Engaging political, economic, media systems. We also have to move towards trust building. And how do we do that? We have to assess the needs and claims of all parties. We have to prioritize the stakeholder voices and promote exchanges when that is feasible. Of course, we know that this is not something that happens overnight. We need to create those localized initiatives. This is why we predicate an approach that is localized, where we start from the realities that we heard in the panel before this one, the experiences in Kosovo, in Albania, in so many areas that were in conflict. Now they are still in a transition in many ways. So this is where we need to concentrate, because we need to build a long-term relation. We have to change also relation. We have to make sure that people themselves take credit for what is this change of mentality, change of practice. So the trust-building element, and in longer term, this enhance dialogue. As we were saying, the dialogue is among enemies, it's not among friends. I mean, if you want to be constructive, you have to build bridges. So you build bridges gradually with the tools that we have, harnessing the potential of the economic possibilities, even of artificial intelligence, of social networks, of everything that we can dispose of nowadays. So the approach that we have is, as I was saying, articulated in a way that we analyze the situation, we try to analyze the situation as much as possible in order to reverse the direction of the tensions and promote reconciliation and collaboration, enhancing human security, building bridges, as I was saying, and at the same time, identifying from the very beginning the de-escalation opportunities, supporting grassroots, localized peace building and coexistence. The requirements are also to make sure that we address the root causes of the conflict, but we also need to know that we cannot stop there. You can analyze as many root causes you want. But if you stop there and you don't move towards solutions, if you do not have a solution-oriented approach, meaning when you bring people together, you facilitate, because that you do not solve things yourself as a mediator, as a facilitator. You bring people together. But bringing people together, you need to seek solutions. You need to bring them together around problems where they can find a solution themselves. It can be in economic interest, it can be the environment, it can be the climate change, as we said. There are so many instances of unresolved issues that are presented to ourselves as urgent, as threats that we are confronted with. There are issues of poverty, of intergroup tensions. Of course, we have to try to do that. The first step in our process is, of course, research. We have Luca here. Luca, raise your hand, is our head of research at the University of Maribor, the alma mater of Maribor, and we have a group of people that I like to call them volunteers, because we don't have any other way of describing them at this very moment, that will help in the research and facilitation and in this problem-solving strategy that we have devised. The experiences that we have are just starting. The important methodology, I have devised the methodology that we are testing as we speak. We are now only a few months into the experience, I may say. With these partnerships that is growing, we have, for instance, the Black Sea University Network, and Emma will talk about an experience we are having with them that is related to the Tatars community in Crimea. So one community, of course, suffers out of the situation in the war in Ukraine. But the most important thing that I want to say is the approach we are taking is geared towards understanding the systems of conflict, understanding the drivers of conflict, not necessarily solving them ourselves, but also undertake a process of appreciative inquiry. That means do not concentrate necessarily on the negative aspects of the relations among communities, but also find positive commonalities. This is the way somehow to unblock the obstacles that, of course, present themselves in any negotiation, in any discussion. So we want to encourage a wider uptake and validation of our method, and also promote peer learning, and promote a comparison among the various experiences that we have. What I was saying yesterday, I think is very important, that we are not necessarily trying to upscale interventions. We want to concentrate on a series of small, localized experiences that can change the mentality on the ground. This, I believe, might have a much better result, produce a much better result in the long term than trying simply to upscale the experiences on the ground from one to the next. Now, I would like, since the time is passing, and maybe we take questions, I'd like to pass the floor to Emma, who is one of our researchers and volunteers, Emma Slažanska, who has been involved with me, with Luca, into this exercise of understanding the process. I mean, understanding how you relate to a particular issue and trying to collect the information, validate the information in a way that is conducive to a better peace building. So let's remember that we are all involved into a peace building process that is probably never lasting. It's really a continuum as an experience. And we need, from the very beginning, to adopt a technique that is not just the helicopter view. It's not just the high ground approach. It's really deep down. It's the helipad view that we need to adopt. There is a personal experience I want to mention before I pass the floor to Emma. Maybe some of you remember Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was a prominent United Nations official that I had the privilege of working with in what we call the former Yugoslavia. and you know, we were touring around at some point, I don't tell you why, but we were in helicopters. We were really on an helicopter, and we were going from Dubrovnik to Tuzla, I think. And we had, of course, to negotiate with the sides, with the parties, a lull in the fighting in order to land wherever we were. But it was a very foggy day. Huh? There was a lot of fog, so you couldn't see. You couldn't even see ourselves in the helicopter almost. And the noise was of the propellers, you know, would impede us to talk to one another. So at some point, I scribbled something on a piece of paper. I said, Sergio, what do you think? What happens here? Because it's an hour that we are going around on these hills of Tuzla, Sarajevo. I don't remember where we were, and we are not landing. We had another helicopter who landed already. The problem is that the fog impeded us to go through. And he wrote, he just wrote that, literally, we are searching for a break into the clouds. And this is what I mean, finding a break into the clouds. It's a metaphor in what we are doing now, trying to find openings, trying to find new strategies, as we said, new approaches that can bring us together, where we can discuss among ourselves, even with those who do not want to discuss. Emma, to you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Donato. I'm going to be very brief, don't worry. I know that we're kind of getting hungry as well. So good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues, students. It is a real pleasure for me to be here today. My name is Emil Slažanska, and I recently completed my studies in international relations and diplomacy. I have worked with political NGOs in the Czech Republic, and also as a researcher for historical documentaries or documentary films in international media. So I had the opportunity to kind of combine my interests in global affairs and creative storytelling. As Donato said, I'm currently volunteering as a junior researcher within the Global Peace Offensive. I joined this initiative through participation in the Interparliamentary Union's Assembly in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where I first met the mastermind, Donato Kiniger, who introduced me to the premise of the Global Peace Offensive. I found the strategy very, very promising, and I was way later on involved with preparation of a pilot application of the methodology for a conference called the Challenges to Peace in the Black Sea region, that was focused on the role of the Tatar communities, who today make up roughly 15% of the population in Crimea. I would now like to share a concrete example of how this methodology can be applied in practice. This methodology has been created by Donato and Charlotte Ornemark, and the conference was structured as a sort of exercise to see how a diagnostic framework could generate or show insight in real-life setting. The starting point was to place Tatars historically and holistically. Many of us probably don't know the extent of the layered history they endured. I didn't either. The 1944 deportation, which brought decades of exile. Then gradual return to Crimea beginning in the late Soviet period. Then again annexation in 2014, and later on they were once again affected by the full-scale war and escalation till this day. These are all instances that shaped the Tatar identity as well as their political positioning and regional dynamics. Tatars suffered historical injustices and were victims of contested sovereignty. But at the same time, they were able to maintain these ties across Ukraine, across Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, which also showed to be a bridging potential. And that's where I found most of the entry points, the bright pearls in the storm, as Donato says. And they were very important and hopeful to highlight. This pilot focused more on mapping the dynamics rather than some extensive content. We did have some time limitations. And one of the most meaningful moments for me came during the appreciative inquiry stage Donato mentioned, where I was looking for positive practices that already exist in this region. So I read the OSCE assessments, and the relations between Crimean Tatar, displaced persons, and the host communities in Western Ukraine were described as very positive overall, which is easy to just read and move on. But if we get into it a bit more, after 2014, many Tatars left Crimea and resettled in places like Lviv and Chernivtsi. It's safe to say that these regions really had no position to host anyone, and they were struggling with uncertainty themselves. While in displacement, many local volunteers met Tatar families while they were in transit. They met them at train stations. Teachers have immediately integrated children into school so they won't lose that year of schooling. The Tatars opened their spare rooms, gave them, not the Tatars, the Ukrainians opened their spare rooms, shared their food, you know. The host communities said that they just relate to this experience of repression. There was no hostility, and Tatars felt like they were being respected. But that was not the only bright example. I examined Romania's minority governance framework, where Tatars granted representation and cultural protection. I looked at youth-led cultural initiatives that work hard to maintain the Tatar language and their memory. I looked at and mapped many diaspora networks that coordinate their advocacy across the region. Obviously, none of these examples alone can resolve widespread tensions, but they do offer real hope and show the remarkable resilience of Tatars. They prove that some parts are still functioning, and those are the parts that we can build on. And that's, I think, where the hope can begin. During the conference, we also partner with OSCE, whose perspective added an important depth to the discussion. A senior official of the OSCE Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities that is analyzing the Tatar community closely emphasized that protecting minority rights is inseparable from ensuring long-term stability. Her reference to the principle, nothing about us without us, aligned really strongly with the approach of the Global Peace Offensive, and also reinforced the importance of inclusive dialogue in peace-building efforts. As a pilot exercise, we concluded with lessons rather than prescriptions. The main lesson was that Tatar community across the Black Sea already possesses many of the ingredients necessary for bottom-up peace building. Local knowledge, cultural resilience, and cross-border solidarity are not abstract concepts, but they are visible in practice. Now, if you let me shift into a personal tip. This experience clarified why I chose to volunteer. I had grown increasingly uncomfortable with discussions of conflict that felt repetitive and detached from the lived reality of the people affected. We often analyze the suffering in detail, debate over and over who is responsible, and that's where the analysis usually ends. Yet I kept asking myself the question, after naming the problem for 100th time, what changes for those living in it? For my generation, I guess for everyone, security does not primarily mean military capabilities. It means whether institutions feel accountable, whether education is meaningful, whether cultural heritage is supported, and most importantly, whether people can live with dignity. We, the young generation, have the tools. We have digital tools, analytical tools, cross-cultural tools that allows us to contribute in new ways right from our homes. And I value responsibility and transparency, and I think they can complement traditional diplomatic work. As a junior researcher, I cannot negotiate agreements just yet, but I can help clarify issues, identify functioning dynamics, and document resilience. This preparation work may seem modest, But I truly believe it gives me some sense of accomplishment and hope. Again, this pilot convinced me that the diagnostic approach has real potential to change the way we look at conflicts. And I hope to continue developing it further through expanded networks and collaboration. If there's interest, the Tatar paper I wrote is available and we're able to share it. And we're also happy to invite any of the students that are here and want to volunteer and are interested or found any interest in whatever we said here with Donato. Donato is a wonderful mentor. He has many things to say. A wonderful person. So I invite you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for your insight from the viewpoint of, as you say, the junior researchers. This is so seldom that in a panel also the youth get a voice. When I turn to our last panelist, I would break my own rules and would say 2 words, not so much an introduction, but one point is that she's a colleague of mine. We are working on the same university since 3 years, and we met first time here in Kőszeg. With this, I want to emphasize. This is first and foremost, but this is just to emphasize the importance of something like this winter school, where people can come to a city to have a kind of deceleration compared to Budapest life, where you can think, when you co-think, you meet and discuss. Now, the second point is when we come to this discussion yesterday evening, and I also, in her CV, you can see that she's a sitting member of the Hungarian Constitutional Court. This means that she's not only a dean of a faculty, but she is what I may call a political doctor. As a normal human being, we are accepting medical doctors to tell us don't drink, don't eat too much, walk more, and work less. Work more and work less. Okay. Now, the judges of the Constitutional Court in a democratic country are the ultimate instance where they can tell the politicians, watch out, what you are doing is not good for democracy, not good for your health, not good for your country. So this is an enormous responsibility, and now I put a lot of responsibility to your shoulder to come up with your presentation, which is what a political doctor tells us. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and with your permission, I will stand up. So that we can see each other, but also so that I can get to lunch faster. Now I'm speaking in my capacity as an international lawyer and someone who has worked in the humanitarian sphere. I've spent 8 plus 2 years with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I always say that humanitarian work has stayed with me and stayed with my heart. So the title of this panel is Pathways and Challenges to Cooperation. And by that, we often mean institutional coordination, partnerships across sectors, political priorities, and these are things that all matter very much. Now I would like to focus on a form of violence that is appearing in armed conflicts, and it cuts through the basic tenets of society and all recovery efforts, and this is sexual violence in armed conflict. And through this topic, I will demonstrate what exactly pathways and challenges to cooperation really mean. Why is this topic so complex, first of all? Partly it's so complex to understand because there are very many misconceptions around that. One common misconception is that sexual violence in armed conflict is mainly committed with undisciplined militias that are far away or by criminals. That's a false misconception. The reality is very unsettling because perpetrators can be members of organized armed groups as well as militias. They can occur in multinational operations, and it has even involved those as perpetrators whose task is to protect civilians. There was a scandal involving UN peacekeeping forces in the Central African Republic, and it is a very painful reminder that there is no uniform that is a safeguard, and that credibility collapses very quickly when protection actors become the sources of harm. Another misconception is that the law is unclear. That's a false misconception. The law is very clear. International humanitarian law and international criminal law have very strict and straight answers, rules saying that inhuman treatment, torture, sexual slavery, rape, and all other forms of sexual violence are prohibited by law. At the same time, accountability lags behind. And the message thus the victims receive and the society receive is that this can be done without consequences, instead of the message of this is prohibited, which it is. And this further fuels violence, as we will see. And this leads us to the third misconception, which is the scale of the problem. Because we don't hear so much about it, we think that it's a small problem. Just one number. Between 2021 and 2024, the persons needing services due to sexual violence in armed conflict raised from 3.5 million to 7.2 million, more than doubled. Humanitarian funding specifically for this purpose is 0.2% out of all the humanitarian funding given to victims of armed conflicts. So the fact that we don't see these crimes in the daily headlines, or we don't hear so often about them, doesn't mean that they are rare. And even the numbers I gave you are a small part of the problem because latency is very, very big. So probably it's a much bigger number. Now, why is accountability so rare in these cases? First, because of underreporting. Underreporting is widespread, latency is high, there is stigma and fear around these kinds of crimes, and this is often higher if there are male or boy victims involved. Second, there are institutional barriers because these crimes frequently occur in chaos, armed conflict, without evidence or without trained investigators. Third, political interests often prioritize fragile power balance or peace negotiations over justice, and this leaves survivors to pay the price for the international community's discomfort. At the same time, we must be very careful. The fact that sexual violence occurs in armed conflict doesn't mean that it is an inevitable byproduct of conflict. It is a human decision. It is sometimes strategic, it is sometimes opportunistic, but because it's a human decision, it is preventable. And for prevention, we need to see the motivations behind it so that we are addressing accurate and effective preventive systems. Sexual violence in armed conflicts can happen for different motivations. Sometimes, and this is the most difficult to tackle, it happens for strategic reasons. So it's a deliberate tactic of terror. We have seen it 100 years ago. We see it today. It's a tactic for humiliation, for the destruction of a group, for sending a message of power, sending a message of power balance. And the hardest, this is the reason why it's the hardest type to address, because it's systematic and large scale. At other times, it's an opportunistic act where individuals exploit insecurity or displacement or a breakdown of law and order. And the third type of motivation is it's happening or it's perpetrated because it's tolerated. So it becomes a kind of accepted practice. It's known but ignored. It's a behavior within a unit that just happens. So prevention can only be successful if these motivations are identified, detected, and taken into account. Now, when we talk about the effects, and this adds to the complexity of the problem and complexity of how we respond to the problem, is that we must recognize the impact not only on the victims, but also on their wider communities. The impact on the survivor is devastating, both physically and psychologically, but the harm goes far beyond. It extends to families, to communities, and across generations. It comes across generations, and survivors are stigmatized, communities are stigmatized. Their children, the survivors' children, may carry this stigma with them. There may be expelled from the communities, the children together with their mother or whoever was the victim of the sexual violence. families can be torn apart, and this will lead to a much longer-term consequence, economic consequence, because economic survival becomes unstable or impossible in these cases. So they are excluded from community, and this is why I say that sexual violence breaks the social fabric. Now, and this is why the cost is not only humanitarian, but also an economic cost. So if this panel is about resilience, so if we talk about resilience, then we must see conflict-related sexual violence not as an isolated humanitarian issue that is on the margin, but it's a direct driver of instability and long-term fragility. Now, and the complexity comes when you talk about the humanitarian response given to these kinds of violations. I was very shocked when I started researching that for a very long time, and until actually recently, conflict-related sexual violence was not a priority in humanitarian organizations or humanitarian response. It wasn't recognized as a thing. And it was not because they were bad, it's because of the brutal priorities in humanitarian assistance. Life comes before everything else, security, food, shelter, etc., etc. So in the priority rank, it was just not on the top. And as one humanitarian worker said very harshly, one does not die of rape. So it wasn't on the top of the priority list. But you know why it has evolved? Not because someone realized it. It was a small instance. First, the Central African Republic incident with the UN peacekeepers, and another one was the realization that if a victim is treated within 72 hours, then HIV can be prevented. And this made it a life and death question, and this put it on the top of the priority agenda, together with the awareness that the humanitarian consequences are not only on the victim, but also on the communities, and also an economic one, which in the long term is very difficult to address the more you go. So this results in a paradigm shift from the viewpoint of humanitarian organizations, where today, for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross, when they enter, well, they are always there in the conflict zones, but they go from the presumption that if there is an armed conflict, there is sexual violence happening, and so they prepare accordingly. That's a paradigm shift from not seeing the problem at all. Now, how has the UN responded? I don't want to overstep my time, so I will not list all the actions the UN has adopted or taken, but I would like to mention two key areas. One is the establishment of the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict. The office is there to ensure that these crimes are treated as a security priority, not just a humanitarian problem. And so the office is turning documentation into political pressure and visibility. And it's not only this office, but other offices, such as the Office for Protection of Children in Armed Conflict, that are dealing with this issue. The other UN-related framework, which is a wider one, is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. It provides a wider framework for prevention, protection, participation, and accountability in these fields. And we have to remember that sustainable peace is impossible, and I'm looking at Katalin because you mentioned that as sustainable peace is impossible if half of humanity is excluded from the decision making or signing or negotiating maneuvers, or even worse, if half of humanity is deliberately targeted during conflict. And just as a side note, or as a sad side note, we all know that with the decision of the US president, the US withdrew from many international organizations and frameworks in the UN system, including, and there is no way I can understand, including the representative for sexual violence in armed conflict, which has an impact on the work of the office. So what can we do? Well, if we want to translate all this into a cooperated response, there are 4 considerations I would like to put forward. One is that even simple measures can have a big effect. After the Central African Republic, I'm not even calling it incident, tragedy, the UN has adopted very measurable small steps which have a measurable effect, such as resources, the need for documentation, the need for reporting within X hours of events, etc., etc. These small steps had a measurable effect. The second lesson is that prevention must be tailored to motivation, just as I outlined. You have to tackle it if the motivation is strategic differently than if it's for opportunistic reasons or a tolerating environment. And the third is that the response, whatever we take, must be holistic and survivor-centered. You may have realized that I use two terms, victim and survivor. And it's very interesting because it's context and region and country specific. Some regions, or in some contexts, they prefer the word victim because it gives, it supports legal recognition. And in other contexts, they prefer the term survivor because it gives because the victim carries a stigma and because survivor is a stronger enabling word. So it's very interesting that depending on the context, you use different terms. And the fourth lesson or consideration is that there is a diversity of victims and you have to treat them according to that diversity. I already mentioned that not only women and girls, but also men and boys can be victims of sexual violence. Even bigger stigma, even bigger latency, even more sensitive approach is taken. Secondary victimization is very often caused by reporters and humanitarian workers because they treat the victims or survivors as subjects, not as people. And and survivors say that they endure secondary victimization after they have endured what they have endured by these people. And finally, and this is how I would like to close, is what can universities do? We talked about the role of universities and the role of education in the previous panel. So I think we have special responsibilities as university. At Ludovika University, we educate future public service professionals. We educate public servants, military officers, and diplomats. Others train lawyers, journalists, humanitarian workers. If our students graduate without the ability to understand the special circumstances of an armed conflict on victims, on people, and the inevitable harm it causes, then we have failed, both professionally and morally. The second, and this was already mentioned in the previous panel, universities can keep issues on the agenda even when political attention drifts or closes a blind eye. We are sustained spaces for learning and keeping things on the agenda. And this is why, and this is just an example I would like to share, I launched a course, it's a unique course on sexual violence in armed conflict at our university, where we cover some of the things which I have just described, the background, the motivation, the perpetrators, the long-term effects, humanitarian response, etc., etc. And I tried to make it real, and last semester, I invited Nadia Murad, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who was a sex slave captured by the ISIS and managed to escape. And we can teach as many data, numbers, facts, whatever we want to the students. Nothing is compared to a dialogue and to listening to her, powerful, and the person is also very powerful, of her encounters, how she has managed to deal with the problem and how she is now fighting for this issue to be high on the agenda. And it's a life-changing experience for our students. Many of my former students have started to write thesis on that and have started to think of with a humanitarian mind and a humanitarian heart. And the course is going on, and now we will have, for example, the special representatives for children in armed conflict, among others. So there is nothing comparable to in-person discussions with survivors. So I would have very simple proposals if I want to stick to the context of the panel. One is that we realize that armed conflicts bring about overwhelming suffering, and this needs a holistic approach and an approach, and this is when we talk about cooperation, that we combine policy, we combine training, education, and focus both on individual victims and societies. My second proposition is that conflict-related sexual violence shall be treated as a central human security challenge, not just a niche topic within the humanitarian agenda. We have to build cooperation across sectors, as I mentioned, security, justice sector, health sector, etc., etc. We have to be able to give funds to it, and funds are not nice to have, they are needs to have to this topic. And finally, we have to invest in education, because this is where we can ensure that future decision makers will have the proper set of mind to deal with these issues. So my final sentence will be just, when we talk about sexual violence in armed conflict, we have to start replacing silence with visibility. We have to start replacing immunity with accountability and stigma with solidarity. And this is not only for the sake of survivors, but this is also for the long-term stability that we require to reach sustainable peace. So it's not a peripheral issue to peace building, but it's central to it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.